Thank you for coming. Can we hear me okay? Is the sound about right? This is my talk for today. I always like to think about songs that inspire me. This line from the Gossip is one. There's an equation. You plus me equals death to the science of those who dare to forget. I do want to extend some thanks, and I'm mostly going to read from a script today because I'm trying to do too many things, and I would admit that right now. So I'm going to go from 4:05. I'm going to try to be done by 4:50. So I want to extend some thanks to many people before I begin my talk, but before doing that, I'd like to begin differently because, frankly, I don't think we can ignore the context in which this award was given to me, the setting in which we are all still working and have been working for years, really, not just weeks or months. Some numbers. Roughly 13% of the population of the United States is black. And while 12% of college and university students in the U.S. are black, less than 6% of the faculty are. Here at Ball State, 8% of our undergrads and 6% of our graduate students are black. Less than 3% of our faculty are. That's 29 faculty out of the 1,027 full-time instructional faculty. I know I might be preaching to the choir, but I think it's important to point these out. Roughly 18% of the population in the United States is Latinx. And while 16% of college and university students in the U.S. are Latinx, less than 5% of faculty are Latinx. At Ball State, 5% of our undergrads and 6% of our grads are Latinx. Less than 3% again of our faculty are. This time it's 25 faculty out of 1,027. So my first thanks need to go with people who helped me with these numbers, with Melinda Massinio here, and with Jacqueline Hidalgo, a colleague of mine at Williams College, for highlighting these dismal numbers. And we do not compare well as a discipline, but also as an institution. If diversity is a genuine commitment of our university community, we are falling down on the job. A strong 21st century university needs to attract a diverse student body, support a diverse faculty, and deliver a diverse curriculum. As a scholar in religious studies, I couldn't help but notice plenty of claims about transformation, even Christian-laden words like repentance, in this direction from various empowered members of our community this past summer, but I've seen very little action or even promise of substantive action to vigorously and credibly address a climate on our campus that makes this a difficult, even hostile environment for many black and brown folks. So I'll leave off for now with this brief and frankly inadequate observation because I did promise to deliver a talk about my research work in gratitude for a lot of the people in this room, especially sponsored programs, for this kind recognition. But I do think this should be all of our work. We have to make this place what we know it can be, and we will need to do it together. Thus, it's somehow fitting that this year's research award fell to me as a religious studies scholar, since religious studies in particular addresses the complicated world in which we all live. It is organized to address the variety and complexity of religious people and practices on our planet and in the past. Thus, learning in religious studies is preparation for engaging in the world, for knowing ourselves and others better, a dual kind of learning process that likely should be at the heart of a university education. In short, it is one very important kind of diversity work as well. And it still mystifies me how places claiming to be universities do not actually require students to even acquire a basic religious literacy, given the world in which we all live. Despite many proclamations to the contrary sounded multiple times in the last couple of centuries, religion is far from dead. It's not even dying. If anything, religion seems alive and important in so many increasing and often unanticipated ways. So to provide some basic orientation for those of you playing along at home, because I'd wager most of you have never been in a religious studies classroom, religious studies focuses on all the things that humans do, the range of activities and practices that have historically and also recently been called religious. Religious studies then looks like and does a dizzying array of things. It borrows approaches from pretty much every discipline in the humanities and the social sciences, and the really weird people adapt some from the natural sciences. Scholars might observe rituals and their practitioners. They might analyze popular or subcultural trends. They might travel across the world. They might beg monks to consult old, dusty copies of prized manuscripts. They might digitally map incidents of Islamophobic violence. They might record how local communities grapple with crumbling infrastructure, or more tragically, a losing football team. Sure, some scholars are focused on particular traditions, experts on one so-called major religion or another. Still others focus on a region or a time. Still others, like me, cross times and places. I live about half of my life in the first and another half of my life in the 21st century. Scriptures are important in such contexts, but they hardly define, let alone limit, all the fascinating ways in which people are religious. Here at Ball State, we have super fascinating courses, for instance, in religion and popular culture, on hot-button, highly contested issues of public debate, and newer courses on Islam. And I say this to students all the time because I loved college so much the first time through. I love hearing about the other courses they're in, that they're taking, and they want to talk about how to get their writing better and so forth. And I'm totally sympathetic, and then the bargain is that I make them talk about other things that they're doing. And I envy their opportunities that they have to study with other colleagues, especially in religious studies like Jeff Brackett or Matthew Hotham, who's here today. So seriously, point out to your students course registration starts next week. You have to check out these courses. If I had to do it over again, I would definitely start with those, and I don't think I'd be taking my classes. So having oriented you briefly to what even is religious studies, or rather, what isn't it, right? I mean, it's covering all this stuff. I should pause to thank some colleagues I just mentioned for their support and their amazing work, but I'm in a joint department with a genuinely strange field called philosophy. I definitely need to thank the patient philosophers who found ways, they're also humble, to support my research. From the truly skimpy resources left for humanities here, particularly our two previous chairs, one of whom's here, Julie Thorson, but also Dave Concepcion. I still think I work on the more interesting side of our department, but I know I would not have been able to do what I do without your considerable labors. So what is my research anyways? My subdiscipline then is biblical studies. And those colleagues from outside of Ball State who wrote in generous support of this outcome for this award, some of which the provost read about an hour ago, come from this corner of religious studies. Those most immediate peers and colleagues are from around the world, and they inspire, they challenge, they support me in all sorts of ways. Biblical scholars obviously focus on texts that have been canonized as scriptures by Jewish and then later Christian communities. Scholarly approaches to these texts have predominantly been historical. But in the 20th century, we've seen an explosion of approaches. I probably should just adapt your explosions, right? Angles, perspectives brought to these projects. So surveying the most compelling directions from the last several decades of biblical scholarship takes us in crazy, vivid, maddening, and riveting directions, most of which I will not be able to narrate for you today. This means that biblical scholars run the gamut from very traditional approaches to archaeology, text criticism, philology, and positive historiography to other more dynamic and experimental, socially, ethically, and politically attuned perspectives developed in conversation with larger trends, for example, in cultural studies and critical theories of interpretation. So many biblical scholars teaching and research are at home in multiple disciplines. Sure, things like religious studies and classics, but also women's and gender studies, race-critical, post-colonial, queer, post-humanist, affect-attuned approaches, to name a few. At Ball State, I'm a religious studies professor, but I have affiliation in women's and gender studies. But in all my previous positions, virtually all of my courses were cross-listed with 3, 4, even 5 different departments. Here, this has meant that I'm in conversation with students and colleagues from a range of departments who work in these interdisciplinary directions, and some of them are in the room here. They might recognize some of the conversation partners if I make it to the final third of this piece. Practically speaking, this means that I and other biblical scholars read pretty eclectically, and it's perfect that I'm here in the library. Thank you, Ball State Library. Great libraries are hard to replace. Following where our research questions lead us, often in a variety of directions. So my work reflects some of the riotous variety within biblical studies, as it dances between the pursuit of historical questions and historical figures for sure, but also matters that people think are abstract, or they say I'm theoretical. But I think that's mostly when I'm talking about how people are trying to make sense of biblical figures in the context that they work in today. I hope the brief sampling of my research that I'm going to try to narrate for you in these next few minutes will give you a sense of this dance. So I work on Paul's letters. How about that? A little more direct for once. I emphasize letters here, though. I don't work on Paul. I work on these epistles because, honestly, I find the subject of Paul to be one of the least interesting things about Paul's letters. I guess you could say I'm just not that into him. So then why should I, or frankly you, care about the letters attributed to him and only later canonized and comprising the largest portion of what's called the New or Second Testament? I can just tell you why I'm interested, and maybe you'll come along for the ride, and why I remain interested all these years later. If one looks for them, the letters attributed to Paul are particularly overstuffed with a series of marginalized, often stigmatized figures. The arguments of the letters depend upon ancient typologies of strange, disordered, or otherwise inferior people. Yet they are also addressed to a series of both named and unnamed figures from a variety of social-political positions in these communities. There are all sorts of other people. My work is based around the notion that paying renewed attention to these figures, to the rhetorical and historical figures called up in these letters, changes the way that we look at the past and then our present. So I just used that phrase. What do I mean by rhetorical and historical figures? So in my fourth solo-authored book, which is coming out next year, for instance, I discuss how Paul's letters redeploy a range of marginalized figures from the Roman imperial context, repeating ancient stereotypes about androgynous females, castrated males, enslaved people, and barbaric foreigners. Thinking about these figures gives us alternative angles on current debates about all sorts of things, including the treatment of trans and intersex folks, about a range of erotic practices, including but not limited to BDSM practices, about which bodies we call disordered, pathological, barbaric, invasive, even terrorist now. As you can imagine, given so many recent events, these are really blistering times for many of the people with whom I work. And this rethinking then, in turn, gives us alternative angles on the ancient figures, too. So for the ancient context, I've written about the way various people are positioned within and then negotiating these dynamics. So I've written on women, on outsiders, on slaves, on children, on peasant and poor groups, on conquered people, and on their many overlaps and intersections. Doing so has required a range of key practices that may or may not seem obviously religious to you: prophecy, baptism, circumcision, hymns, ritual speech, but also friendship, patronage, the military, social networking, travel, imitation, loyalty, safety. And I do this often by using more recent works on concepts like female masculinity, performativity, precarity, receptivity, temporality, haunting, biopolitics, necropolitics, decency, the politics of respectability, the effects of imperial contact, and for today, again, if I get to my final third, sexual exceptionalism. Recently, and for one of my current book projects, this means an attention to what people are increasingly calling affect. This is where bodily sensations meet broader socio-political dynamics. So I'm kind of fixated on sensations like disgust or trauma, but also more positively, solidarity. And I think these are surprisingly relevant for identifying and negotiating texts like these ancient epistles and how they function then and now. So to be continued, and so it's kind of a word salad of a lot of things I've worked on and you can ask me more about. I won't cover all of these. I welcome follow-up questions or just your own observations or curiosities about some of those after my brief illustrative talk, maybe today, but maybe in a follow-up email. So how do we do this? How can we approach these other people? What tools and approaches do I use? Let me tell you about a couple of important scholars and some key concepts that they stress. This scholar here is the feminist biblical scholar Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. She was one of my mentors. In fact, when I read her book in undergraduate, suddenly it clicked. I was like, oh, I know how to do my thesis now. And she has innovated in a variety of ways. I can't do justice to her magnificent work. But one of the things that's most compelling and that I can briefly describe for you is this concept of kyriarchy that she has coined. So obviously, if she's interested in women in the ancient world, you might think that an analytic term like patriarchy would give us leverage, right? So patriarchy is describing how males are in charge of a social political system, often by claiming to be in a father-like role. This doesn't really explain reality in a rich, dense enough way, right? This is a single-factored form of analysis, right? So it's not just the rules of fathers. So she suggests we use the word kyriarchy, right? So arche here, kind of how to rule. Kurios is the Greek word that gets translated lord or master. It's a word that would be used in a variety of settings in the ancient world. So you bet a husband would be called a kurios, a slave master would be called a kurios, a father would be called a kurios. This is one of the most important titles that the Roman emperor takes for himself, right? So these are interlocking roles, in fact. And so instead of imagining the world as kind of a circular entity divided in half where there's all the males on top of all the females, that actually doesn't seem to describe socio-political dynamics, either in the ancient world or our world very well. So kyriarchies are pyramidal shapes, right? We're talking about multiple systems, so that's why it's also think about this in a three-dimensional space. Think about all this space in here, and think of a variety of arrows going down and overlapping and mutually intertwining with themselves, right? So if there's something like sexism, that's just one trajectory that combines and intertwines with ethnocentrism and racism, right? With kind of prized forms of bodily conduct, with things that we might now call class or economic status, right? So if you're in charge in the ancient world, you're not just in charge because you're a male. In fact, loads of males are living mostly in the middle, or you notice that in pyramids, there's more room at the bottom. Very few people are at the top in most socio-political systems, right? In the Roman Empire, it's the emperor. Why is he the emperor, right? Not only because he's male, because he's elite, he's free from a long line of free people, right? He's of the right age, he's of the right bodily comportment, he behaves the right way, he kind of controls everyone underneath him in a particular way. This also helps to explain, so these are multiple systems that overlap. So the Roman Empire is not just an empire, it's not only patriarchal, it's a slave system, right? It's a system in which they conquered other people, whole peoples. It's an economic system in which they're extracting labor from people. And these aren't separate systems, they work together, they're on analogy, right? So that not all males become men, right? I know that we often think in our culture that if you just reach a certain age as a male, you think that person's a man, but you think about some of the differential ways in which we use these words. That doesn't work, in fact. So many of my ancestors did call adult black people boy, right? There's a kind of a minor. And Romans felt similar kinds of things, slightly different, but similar kinds of things to some of my ancestors here. So this isn't, Kyriarchy describes overlapping, mutually influential, intersecting systems. So we have to think about how gender, ethnicity, empire, the thing that we call sexuality, economics, intertwined. She wrote about this in the 90s, way before intersectionality was a key buzzword, but this is really helpful for diagnosing kind of dynamics of power. It also, I think, accounts for why the system is maintained, right? Because if you're kind of up here, right, you're happy that you're a Roman, or at least I'm a Roman, right? That's pretty cool. Or if I'm, if I'm a Jewish peasant, but I'm a male at least, and in my household, I'm in charge of my own tiny little pyramid. Right? So you might be invested in trying to change one of these factors, but you're also really invested in other things, right? So this is kind of, empires work this way in terms of divide and conquer, right? And of course, there are some females at the top. I mean, if you're the queen mum, if you will, in the Roman Empire, you're a very powerful person. Being a woman is not just simply described by gender in the ancient world or now, right? Hillary Clinton's reality is really different than women who live on the south side of Muncie. That's just a true thing, right? If you're the royal mother, if you will, you're one of the most powerful people. In fact, if you're a Roman emperor, you should watch very carefully about what your mother and what your wives are doing, because they're probably angling for the next emperor, who's probably their favorite son, and you're taking a lot of time to die, dude. Right? So this accounts for multiple forces and why these things get advanced, right? So despite, or perhaps because of the way these letters repeat stereotyped notions of stigmatized bodies, the letters intriguingly address people from a range of social political conditions. The letters themselves address a variety of people towards the bottom of this pyramid, right, that affect the vast majority of ancient people who lived in the lower reaches of this pyramid. And this helps us to notice these figures and get us to begin to place them and to think about them differently than the prevailing perspectives we have from both classical ancient sources as well as from biblical sources. So some of you might be thinking, oh, he's avoiding gender. How is this connected to gender? And I also heard, don't you teach a lot about sex? And a few of you are students who are in the sex and Bible class. I've heard Paul's letters talk a lot about sex. Are you avoiding the sex, Marshall? What's up with that? Doesn't he tell us the kind of sex we be having? How do ancient sources reflect on this? Oh, not that. This is what we have here. And there's been a lot of fascinating work on the history of sexuality. Michel Foucault made some of his ideas about the ancient world famous about this, but it actually requires a lot more nuance than his project provided. I find one of the most useful resources is the work of a classical scholar by the name of David Halprin. And he, in fact, is a pain in the tuchus. He would say, you're asking the wrong question when you're asking about sexuality. He says, what makes what sexuality is now? We talk about orientation and all sorts of. He says, no, this is a completely different system when you're talking about ancient people. So stop saying sexuality when you're trying to think about how do people do things with their bodies that you and I might imagine to be sexual contact. He says maybe we shouldn't call it sexuality at all. We should rather call it an ethos of penetration and domination in his famous work, 100 Years of Homosexuality. Right? And what does this look like? This overlaps with Krzysztof Jorenz's work on kyriarchy. This is why I think it's interesting. So what counts as good, proper contact? All kind of contact that's appropriate is penetrative in the ancient world, and it should align with social political dynamics of superior and inferior. Rather, someone who's on top, if you will, socially and politically, should insert themselves into another person who is not their peer. They literally cannot imagine peer-on-peer sexual contact in our elite sources, elite male-free sources, right, for the ancient world. And I have to say that because it's these overlapping categories. Who is the penetrator, right? So certainly females are supposed to be receptive, yes, but it's completely normative, acceptable, even seen as sound and good for elite free males to make use of younger, enslaved, foreign, often conquered and poorer groups of either gender. And so long as the insertive participant is doing the sex to their subordinate and you're not transgressing other people's property, it's not really a problem, right, from the ancient thought world. So this actually intertwines and combines in really fascinating ways with kyriarchy. And so why does this help? Why am I telling you this stuff? And you're like, oh, I want to unthink this asymmetry, this hierarchy that you just told me. I enjoy being receptive. Are you telling me that I'm oppressed? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that that's how they thought about the ancient world. So does this connect to, say, controversial texts from Paul's letters, right? So people are convinced now that Paul speaks clearly on the issue of homosexuality. Someone like David Halpern would say, immediately you're asking the wrong question, right? Ancient people don't have concepts of homo or heterosexuality. This is a very recent idea. Homosexual wasn't coined until the 1860s in German, right? So Romans 1:18-32, maybe this is relevant, right? But there's some dissonance in this text with many of our ideas. This argument, we could say, is kyriarchal, but it's also one that it's mostly consonant with this ethos of penetration and domination. The most relevant passage that people tend to look at is just these two verses in verse 26, right, and 27, right? There women exchange natural intercourse for unnatural. That's it for the women. In verse 27, and the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. Right? This is why I told you to sit closer. I'm not sympathetic if you're squinting. Right? I didn't know the page. You can come forward. Here's a place where just old-fashioned Greek knowledge should help you here. All translations are adaptations and are works of interpretation. Anyone who tells you otherwise is not being honest about acts of adaptation. And I'm not telling you that I can give you all the proper nuance and consonants of these texts either. I don't have mastery here. But the word for intercourse, right, that's translated here, and that's an okay translation. But the Greek word is, and this is not Greek, this is our alphabet, krasis. And a more direct translation of this word is simply use. Right? This is the most common Greek word in the first century for the stuff that we would call sexual contact. Right? This noun, or the verb kraomai, which is the version of that. Why is this relevant? Because in the ancient world, when you have some kind of sexual act with another person, it's actually not with another person, it's done to. You enter into and you make use of that person. Right? And so it's not terribly surprising. Paul of Tarsus is a first century person. He's speaking Greek. He probably dictated the letter in Greek. He didn't write it down himself with his own hand. Right? So he's influenced, and the community that he's writing is influenced by that. So it's this word here that's relevant. Right? So there's a fundamental asymmetry here. Most of us don't prize asymmetry in our sexual and romantic relationships. We aspire to mutuality. We aspire to consent, which is mostly moot for ancient people, so long as you got the consent of the slave owner. If you're going to use his slave, that's what matters. So where does consent reside? Paul's also probably punning about what the problem is. So, by the way, it's not at all clear that this is about female homoeroticism. This is just one noun here about the females exchanging natural use for unnatural. That could describe lots of things. Certainly, if a female is engaging in a sexual activity with another female and one of them is being penetrative, an ancient, elite, free imperial audience would be freaked out by that, and they narrate that a lot. So it could be female same-sex homoeroticism being described here, but this, we don't have enough. It's like one clause. This is all we got. If you're looking for hot girl-on-girl action in the Bible, this is all we have. It doesn't really focus on female homoeroticism at all. So you notice the much longer verses is about the males. It's pretty clear that it's males with males here, right? But is the problem that it's males with males, or is it the problem about which males with which males and who's doing what? And it's pretty clear that Paul's also punning, or the letter is, about someone's being receptive, right? And that is a debasing thing that they imagine in the ancient world. So is the problem here is someone being receptive who's not supposed to be. And Greek and Roman sources are jam-packed with jokes and references to this. This is the best way to undermine a powerful male, is to say, I hear he's receptive, right? And if enough people believe you, guess what? You're no longer powerful, right? So sexual slander works well in our culture, works very well in theirs, right? So it's this real consonance. They're not thinking in terms how we think here. So a lot of people are relieved in this moment, right? When church people come and ask me, hey, I hear you know stuff about sexuality. Come and tell us what we should do about this. It's like, I don't know what y'all as a community have to figure out things. But I can tell you that Paul doesn't know about homosexuality. Paul's letters, they don't know about heterosexuality either. This is a recent way in which we sort things. But you might be relieved. Oh, good. Like, we're not asymmetrical like this anymore. We have mutuality. Paul, he doesn't have our conception of sexuality, so yeah, we don't have to worry about that. I'm a pain in the tuchus, right? So there are these nagging resonances in these texts, and this is where a place where reading more widely and thinking about more recent concepts that have been developed to explain a more recent context. Are we talking about orientation? Yeah, probably not. Or are we thinking about exception or sexual exceptionalism? So this is a concept that was developed by a couple different scholars working at the intersections of critical race, sexuality, gender, empire studies, Jasbir Puar and Jackie Alexander. Most people know more about Puar's work than Alexander. And they describe really a cluster of factors to consider when we're still thinking about, okay, how do I use 21st century ideas to talk about a first century context? What even is sexual exceptionalism, which is hard to say 5 times fast, right? What is it? Well, first of all, many cultures throughout time, but definitely recently and as well as in the ancient world, imperial forces argue that they are exceptional, right? And they do so by using ideas about gender and sexuality, that we do the right kinds of stuff with our bodies, and only us, and those other people are undisciplined and out of control and cray-cray, right? So exception is not just about kind of imperial power, but also about gendered and sexual ideas, right? So if you do proper sexual things, that's a sign of your superiority, right? Ruling groups construct different definitions of sexual propriety in order to claim that they are the exception, that they're especially superior, and those who belong only do the proper erotic things with their own and others' bodies, right? In doing this, this is a way for empires to fold people within the order. If you just listen to us and behave the way I ask you to behave, you will belong, right? We can fold you in to our neo-imperial order, right? So we can claim to be inclusive, right? And the Romans did claim that. We're going to incorporate you into a giant imperial family. That's how they talked about their empire, right? And if you fail to perform the way that you want to, you're part of a disordered pathology, and that itself justifies the fact that I have to rule you, right? You're out of control, right? And doing so actually then offers 2 different destinations. You can either live within this order, or you can die due to your disordered pathology. So there's ways in which regimes find ways to fold people and to temporarily include those who might otherwise be initially cast as aberrant, right? So this functions as an alibi. You can incorporate some while quarantining others who are cast as pathological, perverse, or aberrant, at least at that point. This leads to the 4th point. These are perversely racialized arguments. This isn't just about gender, sexuality, or empire, right? So sexual and religious modes are ways of differentiating between ethno-racial groups, right? So are you a good racial, religious, colonial other? Then you are going to be available to play the inferior role for us. Otherwise, you do not belong, you're excluded, you're propelled into death, and we're going to say it's because you have strange racial and religious characteristics of you. You follow the wrong gods. You do not accept, in the case of the Roman Empire, that our gods put us in charge here, right? So this then means that enemies cannot be incorporated, are then seen as grotesque, as perverse. This is in a range of perverse figures. It's the savage. The contemporary area, we have the sodomite, the terrorist, the gender monstrous foreigner. So these deviants are targeted for death, are associated within a range of aberrant actions and identifications, but their sexual inferiority, even barbarism, is treated then as somehow symptomatic of how they are the enemy. And this works because, right, this is a way to talk about those of us who are on the outside. We have scare figures who are bursting at the gates, right? But this is also a way to say if you want to continue belonging, it's a mode of disciplinary control, of internal control. And on the one hand, we as a group are especially sexually exceptional, but we're also claiming this applies to everybody, right? And this then means that this can keep reappearing, right? So we have this kind of continued kind of internalized control going on with the scare figures from the outside, right? That's a lot, right? So I've tried to summarize. Hopefully we're following most of this, right? So how does this connect, if at all, to Romans 1? And if you look at the wider narrative here, you'll notice, as I already kind of highlighted, really it's just a couple verses that are most directly about sexuality. So that's also another kind of apologist move to say Paul's not even really focused on sexuality here. Okay, and that's kind of helpful, but what's disturbing is in fact the way Paul's letters craft this argument, and it looks like an ancient version of sexual exceptionalism, right? So this is a longer, basically us versus them argument. This is a lot about what they do, right? So in verse 19, it's plain to them, right? And it's about him, the letter constructing who's going to be on the inside by talking about who's on the outside, the them. And what is the them? The most important thing that kind of you'll highlight, most of this is about what an ancient person might call, especially if you're in a monotheistic tradition, idolatry. The letter reflects a not very common narrative in the Bible, but what was a common narrative among some first century Jews, that at one point everybody knew the correct God happened to be our God, the God of Israel, and they actively chose other gods. So they turn away from the real God, the God of Israel, and so they have misapplied divine knowledge. This is what we would call now religious difference, right? So this religious difference becomes important, and then we have a cascading three-point cause-effect argument. So the deity gives them up, gives them up, gives them up. Paradidomi, it's actually the better translation, hands them over, right? If you were to hand over a prisoner or a pirate, for example, in the ancient world, you'd use this word, right? So their unreasonable religious difference is the cause of their gender and sexual perversity, right? And the they is here. Look, this isn't just any old females, it's their females. It's not us. Look at those people, they're disgusting. Am I right? They do the wrong things, Canadians, am I right? Maybe French people, right? Depending upon if you're a fan of our president, maybe it's the Mexicans, right? Maybe it's the invading horde. These women are excessive and uncontrolled, right? They aren't brought into line. They refuse to recognize this deity. And so also sometimes people say, look, it's just a side effect of the main problem here. And this is not a common etiology for same-sex erotic contact now. People don't say it's because you're a polytheist. They also don't say God turned you into that, right? Oftentimes if someone says God gave me my sexuality, people are trying to say something affirmative here, right? So their unreasonable religious difference becomes the cause of their gendered and sexual perversity. So on the one hand, people want to say, no, it's not about sex, it's not about gender, it's about idolatry. And yet, Paul has written, and he's quoted here, a really long vice list. This is a thing that kind of ancient people do. They just memorize all the good things you should do and all the bad things you shouldn't do, right? But Paul's letter has pulled out the sexual sin as if it might be especially symptomatic somehow, right? So the vice list is important here, but there's this idea that I'm trying to produce a properly loyal member, and by calling up the idea of someone who has misapplied divine knowledge. Scholars often recognize this is an ethno-racial stereotype of non-Jews. Right? So the Jews talk this way about the so-called Gentiles of the nations. And they say that they're barbaric, they have the wrong religion, which leads them into all these directions. Ancient Jewish people are very clearly adapting Greek and Roman ideas for their others, barbarians. In fact, this is one of the few letters in which Paul even describes, right, his audiences as both Greek and barbarian. Right? So while Paul is a first century Jewish person, he's thoroughly Hellenized, and the world is divided into us and them. Right? The Greeks and the barbaroi, the nonsensical people who talk baby talk and have the wrong religion and are out of control. Right? So there's this way in which kind of Paul has been steeped in this way of thinking. So that idolatrous polytheism leads to a loss of control and erotic contact, not according to natural use. So he's pulling out an externalized threat and a scare figure here, right? And he's, on the one hand, this is all them, right? It's all of them. And again, sometimes apologist people say, but look, actually he then hoists it. So like if you like this, you're like, yeah, that's right, those people, they're nasty, right? And like I'm feeling like I'm a part of the thing. Then the second chapter, and there's no chapters original to this, it's not like when he's adapting it. Chapter 2, right? He turns to you, in fact, and says, you are doing the exact same things. Now the enemy is within. You have to internalize this way of being to make sure that you're properly loyal to the vision that we have. The monstrous figure that's been stalking us from outside is right here in our midst all along, right? And so for us to be distinctive, we have to be not like them. We have to be superior, right? And we have to work very hard to be folded into, if we want to, if we do right, we'll be given eternal life, right? If we just learn to behave this way, right? We'll be given glory, immortality, and peace, right? Glory, honor, peace, right? Both Jews and Greeks, if you just conform to this way of thinking. So this is not going to be for everyone. It's only going to be for some. One belongs only among such eternal living on the basis of death. Oh, wait, no, let's go back, right? So the very end of here, right? These people deserve to die, right? I will get life because other people will die. God's wrath has been stalking a gender-troubled Gentile since at least the 18th verse. But even as the argument begins to offer life for some, the violence of division spills over into the following chapter, where Paul's version of the deity is repeatedly promising judgment, wrath, and distress. So the biopolitics of a Pauline population is installed through the necropolitical, right, the kind of politics towards death, right, acts of this version of the divine. God doesn't have to be this way for you. Right? This is kind of how Paul's letter to the Romans constructs it. Some can fit in, some can belong, some can be incorporated, so long as these others are quarantined to be excluded and eliminated. But this is not the entire picture. This is just a sample of 2 chapters. And we're stuck with how Paul's letters repeat ancient stereotypes of a barbarically foreign other who's out of control and has a combination of gender, sexual, ethno-racial, imperial, economic strangeness. Right? How do we start approaching the letter from other directions? And how do we begin to realize that Paul's perspective is just one of many perspectives in this community? Paul is writing to an audience here. We are overhearing just part of a conversation. And the final chapter of Romans is really fascinating. The first 16 verses of Romans, right? Paul names more than 25 people, right? Paul's writing this letter. This is what's unique, we think, about this particular letter, aside from the fact that it's the longest of his letters. He's writing to a community that he's not yet visited, right? So he's kind of showing, here's all the people that I know and all the people that I want to greet. These people are fascinating, and I can't do enough work on them. And it's really actually very hard work to do that, right? Among these 25 named people and several more implicit groups, we have at least 10 women, a number of solitary figures, 6 pairs, and several groups. The sheer number of people greeted or named in this section indicates how much the letter needs to show Paul's ties to other people, better known in the assembly community at Rome. A number that reflects not only Paul's potential anxiety, maybe about his position, or about the authority of females in the community, or any association with Eastern or barbaric difference. So he's repeating an idea of difference that is, for the Romans, is about the East. Where's Paul from? He's from the East. He's from Tarsus. Where are Jews from? They're from the East, right? So the Romans have lots of ethno-racial stereotypes about all the barbaric peoples, but they have some specific to the Jews, right? So Paul's just one of many people in these social networks, right? Oh my gosh, there's so many things to tell you about these folks, and I've got 5 minutes. Let's talk about, so first of all, just notice that we've got a female deacon here. He's sending the letter probably with her, and she might be reading it out loud in various communities, so imagine that. Don't imagine nice buildings that we have today. That's why I don't translate the word church. When I say the word assembly, it's the Greek word ekklesia. We have a pair here, Prisca and Aquila. One thing that's interesting is typically when male-female couples are named in the ancient world, typically the male is named first. Prisca is named here first. This couple shows up in multiple texts, in 1 Corinthians as well as in Acts. Acts is not terribly reliable. It's difficult to kind of say much about them. He sends greetings from them in 1 Corinthians at the end of the chapter. They're described as people who work with me, right, in verse 3, and they risk their necks for my life. He asks that he gives thanks, and he also asks all the assemblies of the Gentiles to give thanks to them. It's kind of surprising. So it's a reminder, in fact, of the precarity of the risk, in fact, of the members of these communities. They are not hyper-potent, right? They are not impenetrable penetrators like imperial forces. This is interesting that there's this claim that all the assemblies of the Gentiles give thanks to them. It's a little bit difficult to do a whole lot of work on them. Traditionally, people identify Aquila as a Jewish person from Pontus, which is in the region called Asia Minor from the east. Prisca, some people assume, well, if she's a woman and she's married to him, she must be Jewish. But the name itself is a Latin name with ties to the Roman noble class gens Aquilia. So it's a possibility that she was a freed slave herself. That's kind of when you take the names of your people. So even here we have a slight hint of a Jewish-Gentile partnership. Maybe she wasn't Jewish. But the fact that maybe if they're both Jewish, again, that somehow the churches of the Gentiles are thankful to these Jewish folks. That there's something about being in Christ that bridges differences between Jews and non-Jews. That's what Gentile means. Gentile is just a Jewish version of barbaroi, right? There's more long greetings to another male pair right here, Andronicus and Junia. All right? He describes them as my kin and my fellow prisoners, so again, prison. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before me. So prison, right? Prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before Paul was. People freaked out about this. Junia is a female name. After the Protestant Reformation, they tried to change the text and say this can't be a woman, because women can't be apostles. The Latin and Greek word Junius does not exist, as far as we know. And there are literally hundreds of versions of the female name for this. That's a later problem. It's not a problem for them. Similar to Prisca, Junia's name might be the sign that she was a freed slave from a Roman imperial household. Right? The fact that he describes them as kin, though, indicates we think that they're probably also Jewish. Notice that they were imprisoned. These names are brief reminders that this movement and their assemblies pre-exist Paul and his letters. So these letters are written in the mid-1st century. They aren't yet scripture. He's not anticipating that we're going to do. We're reading other people's mail here. There are communities all over the Mediterranean world. These things got saved. But if we're looking for alternative angles on those people addressed by figurations like the sexually barbaric other that shows up in the first chapter, right? I think it's vital to remember that people assembled and organized in ways besides the way that Paul promotes. Paul's generating an argument here and trying to convince them to do something. And you don't just fire off a letter. This is effort. And so Paul's letters indicate anxiety that you're not doing the thing that's being advocated for. So this possibility then becomes easier to imagine when the priority and pre-existence of people beside Paul is plain to see in passages like this. He writes to so many people in the community at Rome, a place that he's only anticipating to visit. All right? The prisoner reminds us that there's lots of stories about Paul being in prison, but the idea that multiple people kind of put their bodies on the line and would have also been seen as disabled, abnormal, belonging at the lower reaches of hierarchy from a Roman imperial perspective, reminds us that lots of people were carceral bodies. As we move forward, you'll notice that he picks up the pace on these naming multiple people here. So these are the more important people that people have. Look at that, Prisca and Aquila get multiple sentences, right? But there's all this allusion to loads of precarious bodies, right? So we have two groups, for example, in 10 and 11. Those who belong to the family of Aristobulus, those who belong to the family of Narcissus. You notice he's not greeting these two people. That's probably because these are people who are in the household of those folks. And Aristobulus and Narcissus are probably not part of this movement. He's probably addressing a whole bunch of slaves here in the Roman community. Just based on guesswork from epigraphy, the other names that we have, Ampliatus in verse 8, Herodian in verse 11, Tryphena and Tryphosa in verse 12, Persis in verse 12, Hermes in 14, Julia in 15, Nereus, we think these are all slave names. I'll just talk about one last pair, and this is Tryphena and Tryphosa. They're a pair. You'll notice that I talked about these two people as husband and wife and these two people as husband and wife. That's the most common thing. We do have stories that indicate that married partners traveled and engaged in, for lack of a better word, missionary work. And so when males and females appear together in these titles, they're married. Tryphena and Tryphosa are two females, and they're named as a pair. What's the deal with that? Are they more than just co-workers in the Lord? Their names also indicate that they're probably freed slaves. They were freed together. Being freed is not the same as free, and I can talk more about that in the ancient world. They somehow seem bound together in this process. Their names, the Tryphao, the beginning, maybe indicates that their owner named them a similar way. This Greek verb has this kind of voluptuous, sensual quality. So this is also a distinct possibility. One of the things that you do with your slaves is you use them for sex, for yourself, or for others. So most prostitutes in the ancient world are slaves. So these might have been sex-working freed slaves, Tryphena and Tryphosa. So maybe Romans 1 is a defensive or apologetic gesture. Look at all these weird people in the Roman community, right? And so the letter starts off and says, look, we're like you. We're sexually exceptional too. We're disciplined. We're not like those crazy other people. We're not like these other folks. But I think the picture is more complicated than this. The first chapter deploys an ethno-racial stereotype of a barbarically sexualized other. And this final chapter refers really to like this boisterous, strange, eccentric assemblage of people. We have women and we have men. We have free people, we have freed people, and we probably have enslaved people. We have Jews and Gentiles. It appears that most of these people would have been from the Roman East, right? So these communities are comprised of all these people towards the bottom of the hierarchy in these intertwined, gendered, sexual, ethno-racial, economic, imperial roles, right? It's no wonder that participation in this sort of movement would have involved serious risk, including incarceration and execution. It might account for why a sexualized scare figure of barbaric difference is deployed in the opening, but I think it's also difficult to reduce this argument simply to one about sexuality. Some of the figures targeted by such argumentation are starting to sound anachronistically like the monstrous terrorists or the barbarians at our gates now, especially since the way we talk, since the war on terror. So this eccentric assemblage of figures along the edges of these letters makes me wonder, how else would the Gentiles in Christ and the Jews in community have lived alongside each other outside of the ways that have been responded to Paul's figuration? Thank you for your patience in this ridiculous presentation. And there's like, if time, there was not time. But I got to most of the things I wanted to get to. Questions, worries, concerns, prayers for my immortal soul.
Yeah, you mentioned the idea of translation, and that has always been, as somebody who was raised in a very religious household, that has always been of supreme interest to me in terms of how we incorporate the Bible into our lives.
And Margaret Atwood cares about this.
I know.
And there's a great new book coming out on Margaret Atwood and the Bible, edited by friends of mine.
Oh, fantastic.
I need to find more time to read what you're working on. Anyways,
Okay. But I'm curious about how these, because we look at the King James Bible as sort of a definitive translation, and I'm curious, however, about how these things are filtered through Victorian mores, because it seems like most of what we view as sort of morality, I was really interested in sort of thinking about the collisions between how we think of the sex in the ancient world and how that is, of course, long gone to us, and
We
think. So as history has moved forward, then a fair amount of understanding of sexuality is still rooted in the Victorian. And so I'm interested in, I don't know what my question is, but I guess maybe more of like the historical translation as opposed to just language translation.
Sure. So that also could have been a really fascinating thing. It wouldn't be directly on my work, but there's really good work on just how translations of key texts have changed across time.
Right.
And in fact, this is really great work on kind of American religious history by Heather White, Reforming Sodom? I forget the main title. It's from University of North Carolina Press. And she actually highlights that the product that we believe now, that there are 4 passages that primarily tell us that the Bible is against homosexuality. 2 of these are in Pauline letters. This is a very recent way of talking. In fact, it's probably a product, and liberals don't like this, this is actually probably a product of liberal Protestant ideas from the middle part of the 20th century, where they were imbibing not Victorian ideas, but modern therapeutic ideas about eroticism that's aberrant as something that needs to be treated, but compassionately, right? And then suddenly, and this is more the case for 1 Corinthians 6, and the King James Bible doesn't use the word for homosexuality, it uses other words for these words. The word homosexual doesn't show up in the Bible until the 1950s in your English. So if you like the King James Version, there's lots of problems with it. Lots of problems with it. And my Episcopalian friends can't tell the difference between Shakespeare and the Bible for that reason.
I have friends who do that too.
And so the moment that we're convinced that these texts are particularly relevant for these things, reflect back our time more, right? And what I'm trying to do by suggesting that we should juxtapose more contemporary ideas about sexual exceptionalism with this first century thing is to be thinking about rethinking what we know about the first century and how to approach it, but also rethinking about why do we also think that we've got this wonderful progressive view of gender and sexuality. So it is also not uncommon to offer inclusion to some people that used to be stigmatized, so long as you just act in a nice, orderly way and you belong, but we all agree that there are some people who are beyond the bounds and should not be included. Queer theorists call this homonormativity, right? So if you are a good gay person, if you're a loyal gay patriot, or you're a Christian lesbian, but you wait until you're married in our church, or you shack up and live together and make kind of partnership and adopt a dog, right? Or other things, that's okay. But we can all agree that there are these nasty sexual people, right? And they do the wrong things, or the nasty sexualized people are perversely racialized others. So one of the main ways that Americans talk about terrorists as gendered and sexualized scare figures in a variety of ways. We should interrogate on what claims inclusion is offered. And we should think about our own desires to be exceptions. And I should interrogate my own desires to be exceptional too, right? And that's a project for liberals and progressives as much as for so-called conservatives or mainline people. And that's a project that should be interior to religious studies, but as well as to women's gender, sexuality, queer studies. So the short answer, I don't buy that the Victorian era has actually shaped that much of our ideas about this stuff.
Interesting, because it's also a reminder too that history is not linear.
It's not, and it is, it's curly-Q, and there's really fascinating stuff about kind of how time crosses time in really weird ways. And I talk about anachronism as one of the greatest insults you can hurl at a historian, but I think basically all historical work is anachronistic. And that's maybe that might be a more weird theoretical argument to be making. But I think there was a flicker of hand. Julie and Rachel.
So where did Paul and the people to whom he was writing place Christ in the kyriarchy?
Very good question, right? So kurios is a Greek word. It gets translated Lord. This is one of the main titles that's used for Jesus as the Christ. So Christos is a Latinized version of a Grecized version of a Hebrew word Messiah, meaning set aside, anointed person. There's a number of titles that people give to Jesus of Nazareth. Christ is not his last name. H is not his middle initial, in case you're wondering, right? And so it's fascinating that Lord is a title that's used for male heads of households. You're in charge of your little mini pyramid. And households are not just husband and wife and 1.5 children and 3/4 of a pet and a white picket fence. Households include all the subordinates that belong to you. And that would include slaves and freed slaves who still owe you things, any of your property, any of your non-human animals. And if you're in charge of your pyramid well, and I'm higher up and I notice you, I might put you in charge of a slightly larger pyramid in our city. And that way, when I get kicked up in the empire, maybe then you'll be in charge of our entire city. And then you might be in charge of this entire half of the empire. And now I got to keep my eye on you, because if I'm not dead already, I'm the emperor and you're gunning for my job, right? And so the emperor claims to be at the top of a pyramid. So we have to think about multiple pyramids inside the pyramid, 3 space. So there's a real tension here, because they're reclaiming imperial terms for Jesus as Lord, as Savior, as a Son of God. All emperors claim to be descended from a God in the Roman Empire, as a bringer of peace and security. There's all these imperial slogans that get repeated and recaptured. This is, on the one hand, very subversive. Yes. Very subversive. You could understand why, if you said things like this and the Romans caught wind of it and thought you were at all a threat, why you would end up in prison. Prisons are even worse than now. Prisons are terrible now, but they're even worse in the ancient world. You basically go there and die. Like, you don't really survive prisons. They're just dank cells, nowhere to eat. And one of the things that we most know is that Jesus of Nazareth was executed as a criminal by the Roman Empire in this kind of awful, debasing act of crucifixion. So it's this fascinating reversal that they take an imperial term. It's subversive, and yet it then sneaks in this kyriarchical concept. And so it's not at all that strange that 3 centuries later the Roman Empire becomes a Christianized Roman Empire. It doesn't become that dissonant. They just kind of... I think the book of Revelation is harder to interpret once the Roman Empire becomes Christian than Paul's letters of the Gospels. So there. Yes?
So then, in one of the passages we read, it was, they were in Christ before I was.
Yes, in Christ.
Which sounds penetrating to me.
That might be a slight overread, but there is also this problem about, but here's also the problem about if Christ is above us, if superiority is how people make use of us, Christ is up higher, God is higher than the us.
In both places of the hierarchy, both in the bottom.
He started off at the bottom, but because he conquers death, look at where he is now. And we follow the true imperator, right? The true kurios. And you people are just deluded, right? This is, I would say, this is a product of a colonized consciousness. If you're familiar with this from kind of post-colonial studies, right? Colonized people are educated in the mode of the colonizer, and they repeat their terms. And there might be ways that you could subvert the colonial claims, but you also then end up reinforcing. And Paul's letters bear the marks of him being a colonized Jewish person himself, as does. We want to make sure we get to Rachel's questions too, so it's going to be a short question.
So they were in Christ means they're in his house?
Sorry. Christian's not a word yet. So this is just Paul's formula for this weird thing we're doing here, right? So vast majority of Jewish people in the first century would not have known anything about Jesus. So this is a particular sectarian form of first century Jewishness. It's an apocalyptic movement that they believe there's something about how God acted in history through Jesus, and Jesus was executed, that this has radically changed time. And we are in the midst of a massive cosmic change. And if you're part of this thing, you're in Christ, right? You get baptized into Christ. And there's fascinating stuff about Christ's body, and oh my gosh, we got so much to say. There's things in 1 Corinthians about this. If people need to go, they can leave, but folks can also, I gladly keep talking about this for a few more minutes for sure. Rachel?
Yeah, so you made like a really passing comment to Paul probably dictated the letter and didn't write it. And that got me thinking, I mean, I'm interested in the evidence for why we think that, but more importantly, you didn't talk very much about education as a dimension of the hierarchy,
Yes,
or
yeah.
probably education isn't even the right word, but like access to knowledge in various ways. Can you talk a little bit?
Good, yeah, so education, formal education is a product for elite people. It would have been mostly about training elite male sons to replace their fathers. Slaves would escort the elite male sons to their lessons. The slave system is a really diverse, variegated slave system in the Roman Empire. Some of the best teachers are, in fact, enslaved people trained to be slaves. However, education takes a variety of forms. In order to survive, you have to teach people how to do things. to help our little kinship group move on. Paul is also from a major urban area, if we believe most of the sources of him. He's from a city called Tarsus, which is about halfway between Jerusalem and Athens, which is a nice way of describing who Paul of Tarsus was. He's bicultural. All people living in the eastern half of the Roman Empire are Hellenized, that is, they've been Greekified. Greek is the main language of big cities. And so there's actually, for people who care a lot about Paul, which is not me, they have a debate about, was he formally educated? The fact that his letters are sophisticated rhetorical projects that conform to some of the expectations for ancient speeches is a sign that maybe he could have been formally educated. On the other hand, if you're in the marketplace in a big city, there are people shouting at corners all the time. It's like Speaker's Corner, but on steroids in London, if you've seen that. That's actually one of the main ways in which you get an elite person to sponsor you to educate your sons, is you stand up and sound super smart. And then, like, that's also how you get followers in charismatic movements. So even just growing up in a big city, and people are smart. Like, you don't have to have a formal education to figure out, how do I thank grandma for this birthday gift so that I get another one, right? How do I talk to my friends as opposed to my teacher, as opposed to a police officer, right? We adapt and we learn conventions of communication, and that's an educational thing. But education is absolutely something that then creates barriers between folks. How's that to start? Why do we think that these were dictated? Because most letters were dictated in the ancient world. Also, in two of Paul's letters, towards the end, there's these weird moments where it says, see with what big letters I'm writing, right? Which we tend to think that maybe the actual Paul of Tarsus like took up the stylus and wrote those letters for himself. However, most people don't know how to read and write in the ancient world. So Paul would have dictated it to somebody. There's no Roman imperial postal service. It's really hard to send letters. It's a real pain. It's a schlep. You got to know someone who's going that way. So we probably need patrons who have slaves who are disposable or engaged in imperial trade. And you would send someone and you would apostolos somebody. The Greek word for apostle is just someone who's sent. Right? You would apostoline somebody over there, and they would deliver your message, and they'd read it out loud to people. And of course, as you know, as theater, there's scripts and there's performance, right? And so what were people hearing? And how did they respond to that? And imagining in a more dynamic setting is something that a lot of my colleagues are doing. We think about the material culture. And we shouldn't imagine churches. These people, they were getting together maybe in tiny workshops. And you have to imagine, 10 to 40 people max at a time. And it would have been like noisy in cities and smelly, and people would have come from tanning and making tents and doing craft work kind of thing. So those are some of the reasons why the strong hypothesis is that these were dictated. Yeah. Questions, desires for clarification. You've got a biblical scholar, so if you ever had that big Bible question you've ever been dying to ask, now's the time. Maybe not. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. Thank you.